All right, everyone. So we're at Wawa here, and I'm ready to get my Slurpee and my smoothies and my ice cream sandwiches. So we're thinking about supply now. So we want to think about the supply curve. Whenever you think of supply, you want to think of firms. Firms supply the market. Again, demand is consumers. All right, so Wawa is our supply for Wawa coffee, obviously. So here is, if you go back to that beginning cheat sheet or overview, this is the supply information that you need to know. Now, a movement along the supply curve, be completely honest with you, is, in my view, is only what's called a counter shift or a counter movement, where if the demand curve shifts, remember that equilibrium is like gravity, so the supply curve has to go there. To the best of my knowledge, I don't know of an economic event that actually moves that along the supply curve. So generally speaking, you don't have to worry about a movement along the supply curve. But there are four things that shift the supply curve. Remember, the supply curve is upward sloping, and if it shifts to the right, it's an increase. If it shifts to the left, it is a decrease. So the four things right here that will shift the supply curve is input prices, technology, expectations. Remember, we had expectations for the demand curve, but we also have expectations for supply, and you need to know the difference, and that's why you want to think of firms when you think of a supply expectations. And number of sellers, which we'll cover in a second here, all right? So again, what type of companies supply coffee? Obviously, we have Wawa, but competitors would be Dunkin' Donuts, Starbucks, and maybe some local mom and pop type of coffee shops. Maybe you'll start your own business based on economics. You'll be really successful when you'll think about your professor as a consultant. So let's go ahead and look at the first one here. So here's your supply curve. I'm probably not going to have you complete this one, but I just want to go ahead, my face-to-face students, go ahead and graph the supply. So basically, as the price of coffee, the market price of coffee goes up, if it's free, who's going to supply coffee to the marketplace? No one. Who's going to work for free? So unless you're just maybe giving it away samples, you're not going to offer that. So really, until the price gets to a certain market price, companies won't supply the market. So let's say at $1, if I'm running Wawa, I'll start supplying some coffee at 10 quantity. Now again, this is quantity supplied here. At $1.50, then maybe I start supplying more. Maybe I work a little bit harder. And then as that price starts to rise up even higher, obviously I'm more profitable. So I either can work more or I can start hiring employees to supply more to the marketplace. So again, here, like we did for demand, you would just graph your data points and you would get your supply curve here. So here's your origin, 50 cents. Again, there's nothing here. And then it goes there. So as you notice, the supply curve is upward sloping. Those of you that are mathematically inclined, you know what's ever on your y-axis and your x-axis, if it has a positive slope here, that means it has a positive relationship. So what is that relationship? That is the law of supply. As prices go up, quantity supply goes up. As prices go down, quantity supply goes down. And again, if you think of it from a business perspective, if the market price of coffee goes up, more people are going to supply because they can make more money. What's the goal of a business? To maximize profit, right? All right, so that's your supply curve. As the market price goes up, so here, let's say this is my business, if I'm running Wawa Coffee, if you will, and here's my supply curve. Well, as the market price goes up, there might be more competitors that enter the marketplace trying to compete with me. Usually I do this example at Bucks County Community College where I'm selling coffee in front of Grupp Hall, the building that I work in. And if I'm selling this coffee and the price goes up, I'm going to start supplying more. And then as students see that my business is successful, what are they going to do? They're going to start selling coffee too, and they're going to start copying that. So in microeconomics, we learn about barriers to entry and other things. But if there's low barriers to entry, you're going to obviously have other suppliers that enter the market here. All right, the one barrier, not to go too much on a tangent, but Wawa has a good branding image, and they have other competitive advantages that cause a barrier for other businesses to enter. All right, so back to the basics here. We have my supply curve. So just like we did for demand, I graph my supply curve as S1, and then the market supply curve has increased. So I graph the market here. This supply curve would be S1 here, and then the market supply here would be S2. So if I graph those data points, as you notice, the supply curve is shifting to the right, and that's because there's more suppliers entering the market, and that's causing our supply curve to shift to the right. Again, going forward, when we do this this worksheet with a bunch of different examples, you're just going to draw a linear supply curve so you can understand the concepts, as opposed to graphing each data point, which would be too time consuming. All right, so let's look at what shifts the supply curve. So I just went over number of sellers that was here. If, again, the market price goes up, or some companies might just enter the market because they want to make profits and they enter to try and capture some money. All right, so let's look at what can shift the supply curve. All right, so again, number of sellers we just covered. Input prices. Now, we have a lot of things with prices. Remember, we talked the price change of the good itself for demand. We also talked about price of related goods substitutes and complements for demand. So whenever there's a price change, you have to think about whether it's a movement, whether it's a price of related goods substitute or complement, or you have to think if it's an input price. An input price is something that goes into making the product, and that would be the supply curve. So generally, I think of input prices as ingredients, labor costs, taxes, anything that goes into producing that product. So obviously, wheat goes into making bread, so that would be an ingredient. Here's your labor expenses, tractors, things of that sort. All right, so let's go ahead and look at this worksheet here. So again, what I was trying to describe as far as a movement along the supply curve is if the demand curve shifts, there's a counter movement where the supply has to go ahead and meet that equilibrium. So again, the equilibrium is very similar to gravity. If I throw a ball in the air, what do we know is going to happen? The ball is going to come back to Earth. So in the free market capitalistic system, that equilibrium is like gravity. And I can't stress the importance of this. Our market, our entire economy is forcing to the demand supply equilibrium all the time. All right, so if the supply curve would just shift to the left, so here's our economic event, is again, we're analyzing Wawa Coffee. If coffee bean prices go up, so let's say there's a storm down in Brazil, and that's where Brazilian coffee beans are being produced. If that storm or hurricane destroyed all those coffee beans, what would happen to the market price of Wawa Coffee? Well, the supply curve would shift to the left because coffee beans is an input cost, and that would push the equilibrium up here. So again, just like before, you would label, you draw your demand curve D1, you draw your supply curve S1, your original equilibrium is P1 and Q1, so we're right here. And then you analyze this economic event, supply curve shifts left. So what's that going to do to Wawa Coffee? It would push up prices and it would decrease quantity, P2 and Q2. Hopefully this is becoming pretty basic for you guys now. All right, there's two other things that can impact supply, technology and expectations. If we go back here, briefly, technology is physical capital, so that's like machines that produce it. And expectations is future expectations about companies entering the market or exiting the market. All right, so the item being analyzed here is, again, Wawa Coffee. A new coffee machine is invented. So let's say there's a company that makes coffee machines, and they make a new coffee machine that makes it more productive to make more coffee or more quantity. So that would shift the supply curve to the right because that would be an increase. Again, our equilibrium would move down here, and prices would go down and quantity would go up. And let's look at expectations here. Just briefly with this technology, if again, most of you have probably been in a Wawa. If you remember, Wawa used to actually brew coffee in that glass coffee pot that we used to, we make at home. So again, I might be dating myself, but they used to literally make coffee just the way we make it in our house, and they had all the coffee pots, and you pulled it out and you poured it. Think about the liability of that, obviously, someone burning themselves and all that. But nowadays, they have those big thermoses that they brew, and they have these huge physical capital that they brew these big cups of coffee and they make it into these thermoses. So that invention or that productivity gain, that would shift the supply curve for Wawa coffee to the right. And again, next time you're in Wawa, think about all the physical capital that's in Wawa to make Wawa more productive. Those coffee thermos things that are really big, that keeps it warm, that makes it more productive and shifts the supply curve, that pushes down the price of coffee and increases the quantity. Not to mention, from a business perspective, it also reduces the liability of someone obviously burning themselves and the company getting sued. All right, let's look at the last item, which is expectations. So there's an economic event. Starbucks announces bankruptcy and will close in 6 months. So let's assume there's a Starbucks right next to a Wawa. Now, this is not a good example for coffee because typically, coffee's not, Wawa's not going to stop selling coffee because of this situation. But if they think, I would probably change this to like a week or a couple weeks. So if Wawa announces that they're going to close in, say, a week, what could, or a Starbucks is going to close in a week or so, what could Wawa do? Well, Wawa could reduce their supply because they know what's going to happen to the market price of coffee in a week when Starbucks closes. It's going to go up. So they withhold that supply, and then once Wawa or Starbucks physically closes, then they can sell that coffee at a higher price. So again, this is not the best example for Wawa, but a good example for this would be like the oil industry. Actually, gasoline would be a good example. Let's imagine I have a gas station, and let's say there's a war going on over in the Middle East. Well, if I know that that war is taking place and it just started, what's going to happen to the price of gasoline in, say, a week or 2 weeks? Obviously, there's going to be a supply reduction, so that would push up prices of gasoline, and in the future, I could sell that at a higher price. So what I would do is actually, if I was a gas station, I could close my gas station and hold on to that supply, and then in a week reopen because the market price has gone up for gasoline. Let's give you one more example. Let's say I have a firewood business where I sell firewood, and let's say there's a cold front coming through, and I see the weather forecast. I could actually withhold that firewood at least for a week, and then once the cold hits, then I could go ahead and sell that at a higher price because of the expectations in the future. All right, so that's our supply curves. A little bit easier than demand, not as much things going on, but it's a little bit harder for students to grasp because you're more familiar from a consumer standpoint than if you're running a business for a supply. All right, the last thing I should say is you're going to complete this quiz. You do have to review shortages and surpluses, which we'll do an assignment later on. All right, so take the quiz, good luck, and let me know if you have any questions.